Good evening and welcome to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance. Tonight we have a special guest, Mr. Steve Yates. He's a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation on China and national security.
They're manipulating our kids through TikTok. They're manipulating our leaders through financial inducements. They are distorting the information that's on our news in a variety of ways. They've compromised our entertainment industry. That these are all malign influences. The travesty of Hong Kong to me is that the CCP got Hong Kongers to destroy the institutions of Hong Kong. I think that's what basically the political warfare campaign of the Communist Party is everywhere else too. And success for them is getting Americans to destroy American institutions. On the one hand, there is no greater abuser of the environment than China. On the other hand, it has monopolized the supply chain for solar panels, wind turbines, and a lot of components for electric vehicles.
This is Capitol Report, live from our global headquarters in our nation's capital. Here's Steve Lance.
Steve Yates, thank you so much for joining.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you with us, Steve. If you could, first, give us some background about yourself. What got you into the study of China, and where are you at right now in your studies? What has you most interested?
I had a friend from Japan, came into my university as a foreign exchange student. I had studied Spanish before, got good grades, but was not conversant in Spanish. Well, maybe I should switch foreign languages. Signed up for a Japanese class, went over to my new friend that was in the dorm, said, "Hey, Cyril, I'd love your help in studying Japanese and sure hope you'd be willing." He said, "I'm happy to help you study Japanese. I am from Japan, but I was born in Taiwan. I'd rather you study Chinese." And I figured, well, I haven't even started. And so I just went and I switched the courses, got the different textbook, and it was a textbook from the Beijing Yuan, the Beijing Language Institute. And I thought, man, the paper smells funny in these books. It was really cheap paper back in that time. And I saw the Chinese was written in Romanization. I thought, well, maybe they changed things. This might be easier than I thought. So I signed up for the class, started learning. Got to chapter 10, things were going well, turned the page, and there were characters. And all of a sudden I realized I am in too deep and there is no return, and I started studying the language. For whatever reason, it was relatively easy for me versus Spanish. Spanish was illogical to me. It assigned gender to inanimate objects like table and chairs. Chinese was an old language that was very descriptive. And whether it was music and computer programming, the characters and tones were okay, I guess. And off I went. And then later when I volunteered to be a missionary and they looked at my application, they said, well, if you're crazy enough to take a Chinese class and you got a good grade in it, you're definitely going to a Chinese speaking mission. And I was sent to Taiwan for 2 years in the late 1980s. Came back and was immediately recruited into government and continued academic studies in China, studied classical Chinese, got a degree in languages and literature. It was at that time that I jumped in and rode those moments of opportunity from the Heritage Foundation to the White House to media and now back to the Heritage Foundation.
China is such a dynamic country. There's so much to talk about. What area of interest right now? What are you really focusing on right now?
Number one, I'm trying to help people talk about what our objective is in American policy and strategy right now in a way they might agree in a bipartisan way, but also a longer-term strategic way. And I try to use the malign influences of the Chinese Communist Party as the target we want to contain. There's some resistance to containing the country or territory of the People's Republic of China. And that also falls short of what the real challenge is, because the Chinese Communist Party malign influences are here in the United States and in other geographies, so it's kind of a mistake to think of it only in a faraway place. And so the highest priority has been looking at where these malign influences are manifest, to emphasize how important it is for the free world to organize and cooperate in recognizing these, speak the truth about them, and find ways to contain those malign influences. In part, that was accelerated by the COVID experience. where I think a broader swath of humanity learned a lot of the lessons that some of us had lived, but more people agreed now that the government in China is not a responsible stakeholder, that they are behaving in ways that affect our way of life, whether we like it or not. Also, it was part of a personal journey, and this is the other priority for me, where my daughter was killed by fentanyl poisoning, and that made it so that that was a policy issue of priority to me, but it became a personal issue of priority for me to honor my daughter's legacy, to try to fight hard for our government to make sure that those that are responsible for supplying and financing this deadly enterprise are held to account, and that we do everything we can to protect our families and communities. And the People's Republic of China has a sizable role in that. I have lived in Taiwan for a period of time, and I've been blessed to know all of their elected presidents. And I do think that that's a threshold test for the free world to make sure that freedom and democracy can succeed in a place like Taiwan.
And just to state, so sorry for your loss of your daughter. I know it's still relatively raw, being just about a year out. With that said, Steve, if you could sort of unpack the term, the CCP's malign influences.
I use the Chinese Communist Party in part because I don't believe that the People's Republic of China deserves to claim the mantle of Chinese history and civilization. The Communist Party organized and conducted a revolution against everything before it, called things the olds that they had organized their revolution against. It disgusts me in a certain way to hear these revisionists in the Communist Party in China speak as if they are the inheritors of the tradition that they demonized, not just in ideological ways. They killed people and took away their lands and their way of life in the name of politics and as a part of their revolution, the initial revolution and the cultural revolution. And so I use the CCP term partly because I think it's important to disabuse the Western world from this false notion that the People's Republic of China is just continuity as opposed to a fundamental break. And they think, well, they have thousands of years of history. Well, the People's Republic of China does not. And so this in some ways is part of that Confucian exercise of rectification of names and defining terms. As clunky as it is in English, I still think it's important to separate the Communist Party of China being the evil force that we have to try to contain and hopefully defeat from the culture and civilization of China. The malign influences part, again, it's not a natural way Americans would talk. When I talk to my son, if I use the term malign influences, he'd look at me and, what are you talking about, Dad? But if I say, well, they're manipulating our kids through TikTok. They're manipulating our leaders through financial inducements. They are distorting the information that's on our news in a variety of ways. They've compromised our entertainment industry. That these are all malign influences. And then if they want to buy our agricultural land and shape what our universities will study, these are all ways of getting America divided and defeated without them having to do anything themselves. Then my son says, well, that does sound pretty bad. Well, that's what the word malign means. And it also echoes with what a malignant tumor would be like. And I think of it like a cancer. So this is, when I'm talking about the malign influences, I'm talking about the things that we allow them to do, by and large. They're not necessarily breaking laws, although illegally shipping chemical precursors for fentanyl is illegal. But a lot of these areas of influence, buying into our entertainment industry, giving grants that shape what universities do, that's not illegal, but it's malign. And we need to be aware of it. We need to organize against it. So those are some of the ways that I try to give examples of what these influences are and why it's different from times past, and why it's also different from the Cold War we had with the Soviet Union. Our cultures were not as integrated. While the Soviets and their allies might have wanted to do a lot of these things in America and to America, we didn't open the door quite as easily during that time. And so this is a new challenge. Really, it comes down to the CCP being distinct from what people think of as China, and these influences not being contained to a geography far away, but really in our own country, culture, civilization, and government. And we need to try to contain and cut that out the way we would a malignant tumor.
The operative word being malign and malignant. It seems like the examples that you just listed, the common denominator is they're all sort of uses of proxies. And we often associate the term proxy with Iran and Hezbollah, but actually the Chinese Communist Party has mastered the use of proxies. Their fingerprints are all over everything, but they're somehow able to avoid culpability. How big of a challenge is this, and how can we address it?
It's a massive challenge, and you're exactly right about that they are masters at doing this, and they've had a long history of doing it. Part of it is, again, the Communist Party drawing some lessons from the dynastic past in China that they criticized and rebelled against. But if you think of the leadership of China now being an imperial court, and courts tend to have jesters in it, but the courts also have people who come to pay tribute and homage and bow. And we have had a period of half a century where American and other political, government, and business leaders would go and bow to the court. It wasn't an imperial court, they thought, but they've gone and they've bowed to that court. And then what the Chinese Communist Party has done is they would brand people as being friends of China. It sounds very friendly, it sounds very good. But as friends of China, I expect you to go back to your country and help protect our friendship and help put maybe pressure on people that are so mean and criticizing your friend back here in China. But they have done a masterful job of using these intermediaries, sometimes willingly because there was a profit motive, sometimes because they got treated like royalty when they visited China, and it made them feel really good. And they went back home and they were happy to be a part of the enterprise, but in some ways unwittingly doing the Chinese Communist Party's bidding. So we're not having top communist leaders having to come and argue for grants at our universities or investments on Wall Street or purchasing ag land or otherwise doing these things. They're getting their proxies to do it. And in a way, it's an art of political warfare. And ultimately, I think the CCP is one of the most successful practitioners of political warfare in the modern era. And I think we need to wise up to that. And that's part of the work that I've been involved in public policy. I think it's part of the work that the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the CCP really did a good job of. First is making people aware, and then when they see it, they can't unsee it. Second is, now that they've seen it, what can you do about it? And that's where we try to come up with policies and changes of how we do business that make it harder for the CCP to use these proxies that divide us and make us less formidable in terms of giving a compelling alternative way of life that they have to adjust to.
Let's go to a short break and we'll resume our conversation with Mr. Steve Yates in just a moment. Welcome back to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance here with Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation on China and national security. Steve, with regard to China's human rights abuses and its now transnational repression on U.S. soil through the use of proxies, we've seen various uses, whether it's trying to manipulate government and federal agencies. Oversight Committee has launched a series of hearings on political warfare to investigate and research just that, as well as recent reports in the Epoch Times of the CCP influencing the New York Times, the America's paper of record, to persecute the Falun Gong community and the Shenyun performing arts. Talk to us about the scope of this operation and what can ultimately be done to push back.
Yeah. Well, it's an enemy within that we have not wanted to see, much less acknowledge, much less have to deal with. I think Americans had intrinsically a romantic notion of China. It's the fortune cookie. It's Sun Tzu teaching us all how to be strategists. It's all of these kinds of things that people have this classical missionary commercial romance for. And we don't want to believe that there is this.
Right?
Yeah, we
love Chinatown.
We don't want to believe that this is somehow harmful. It's a little bit. I mean, it's risky to make a movie reference, but it's a little bit like the movie Sixth Sense, where a kid sees dead people everywhere and no one else is seeing the dead people everywhere, and you can sound crazy, and I and others have sounded crazy to people over the years to say, you know, these people are here not just to engage in trade. They're here not just to engage in research. They're here not just to get a degree from your university, but they're actually reporting on everyone that's at your university, in your physics department, in your engineering department. And oh, by the way, did you notice the dominant language in your physics department is no longer English? And you have no idea what they're saying in those meetings. And this has been a trend that has been ongoing for decades, but it's really begun to crescendo. But I think it's just naturally Americans didn't want to believe this was the case. We wanted to be accepting and tolerant of different ethnicities, and the CCP has done a brilliant job of using our sensibilities and weakness, I would say, our fear of being called racist, to hide behind the ethnicity of being Chinese, to do a lot of these things. So the organizations that they use to surveil and harass and to engage in other kinds of bad behavior are affinity organizations that are just meant to have goodwill among ethnically Chinese people living in the United States. The fact that they have a communist Chinese flag at their event is lost on a lot of Americans. We've even had elected New York officials holding the PRC flag at some of these big public rallies, thinking it's just showing how tolerant they are toward ethnically Chinese people without knowing that they are actually celebrating and empowering the one entity in the world that has murdered more Chinese people than any other. But I think we are now turning a corner on the knowledge base. I think after COVID, fentanyl, and some of these other things showing up, it's not just victims in China, for which Americans might have some sympathy, but not overwhelming sympathy. But once you have American native-born casualties of this, it's a different level of response. And I think that's how COVID and fentanyl have changed the narrative and awareness. So how do you begin to combat it? First, 10 years ago, you didn't have Epoch Times and some other motivated outlets regularly reporting on these things. And even the New York Times, Washington Post, and others, they would occasionally have some stories along these lines, but they would be caveated and somewhat muted. It's only in recent times that I think we've had a proliferation of people discovering that there are these stories about acquisition of ag land, harassment of dissidents in places like Texas, much less the big cities of New York, DC, Philadelphia, LA, San Francisco, et cetera, that it's spread to the heartland. And so I think that one part of the solution is what the Epoch Times was doing. The Epoch Times, while the subscriber base knows this, a lot of the rest of America has a who'da thunk it moment when they realize Epoch Times is one of the primary English language sources of news for a large swath of Americans. They'd be, what are you talking about? When did this epoch begin, and who are they? But the information environment is first. Second is giving positive reinforcement to our political leaders and other leaders who tell the truth and are advocates for the positive change. And so having people like Marco Rubio, Congressman Gallagher, and now Congressman Molinar, and Representative Krishnamurthy, who's worked on the Democrat side with them in the Select Committee, having them talk more, get more interviews, engage more audience, having them go to Silicon Valley and have an open talk about what some of the real strategic challenges are and how our government needs to meet that in a way that allows for an alternative path to peace and prosperity, not just war with China, but we want to have this decrease of dependence, but it's strengthening of our core. Having our grassroots recognizing the attack on our institutions and working hard to make sure that we don't pull them down ourselves. The travesty of Hong Kong to me is that the CCP got Hong Kongers to destroy the institutions of Hong Kong. I think that's what basically the political warfare campaign of the Communist Party is everywhere else too. And success for them is getting Americans to destroy American institutions. They did that by pouring gas on the divisive and destructive protest movements of recent years that began to call into question our court system, our systems of law and order generally, and public security, debilitating our universities. I mean, what was done in Columbia University in the context of the pro-Hamas or Palestinian demonstrations really is a manifestation of the cultural revolution kind of political warfare the CCP doesn't create but puts fuel on, and it gets Americans to divide ourselves. If they get us focusing our military on what colors there are in a rainbow as opposed to being a lethal and effective fighting force, then they're getting America to be less of a threat to their expansionist goals without having to do anything. And so I think we, by way of having these things covered, by way of having political leaders rise up and get positive reinforcement for this other narrative, by getting our homeland reawakened in our state legislatures and in our broader public, I think we have now the building blocks for a true reset on policy towards China that will be on a foundation that doesn't have to treat them as an enemy if they choose not to be one, but makes it so that decisions made by Beijing can no longer have a decisive impact on our American way of life and the continuation of what I consider to be a blessed American experiment.
Steve, you referenced the bipartisan House Select Committee on Strategic Competition with the Chinese Communist Party. That specific subcommittee or committee has been sort of a bright spot in terms of bipartisanship. You mentioned the Democrat Christian Morthy as well as Republican John Mullen are really coming together and bringing that whole committee together. That committee was put in place and created by former Speaker Kevin McCarthy. It exists at the pleasure of the current Speaker, which is Mike Johnson. Do you anticipate and hope that he will keep that committee in place?
I do anticipate that. I think we've heard intimations along those lines. Obviously, with a House of Representatives so evenly divided, with President Trump picking 3 members of the House to serve in his administration, creating vacancies there, make Speaker Johnson's everyday top priority, how do I keep my majority and not lose 2 or more members? And all of a sudden we have disarray in the House of Representatives where there are bigger questions than does the Select Committee continue. And so first and foremost, we have to acknowledge the political craziness that they exist in. But I've heard positive things from Democratic leaders. I don't know where their influence goes going forward, but former Speaker Nancy Pelosi has said positive things about the work the Select Committee had done and what her party's members on that committee had accomplished by their participation. There are other commissions that exist in the Congress. The Select Committee is a unique creation in recent times. I think it does an especially important job of organizing thought and speech about how we define these challenges. And then the members of that committee, going back to committees of jurisdiction, are empowered and given media and public support for implementing that agenda in their committees of jurisdiction. That's a break with the past that I hope continues. But there are other commissions that play similar roles. There's Security and Economic Review Commission that issues an annual report that I think is very important and does a great job of talking about especially the national security challenges and how economic security is national security. There's a congressional executive commission that was created when permanent normal trade relations status was given to China, and it was empowered especially to keep a watch on human rights and other issues going forward in an era of the most favored nation trade status debates going by the wayside. And so there are still other tools that would go even if the Select Committee went by the wayside. But I think there's been a lot of motivation for the members and leadership to continue it. I think it's important that it continue. In fact, I think it's important enough that the new administration in the White House think of how does the executive branch look at the role the Select Committee has played in the legislative space to adjust this whole of government, whole of society approach to the malign influences of the CCP. How do you adapt that model into the executive branch? They are sort of cats and dogs, different species, but there are lessons to be learned, and I think a model that hopefully will be replicated. I also hope that it's a model that will be replicated among our allies. And so whether we look at some of our friends in this hemisphere, maybe they would have a Select Committee-like approach in their parliaments that drives this conversation more broadly, whether some European allies would look to have the similar kind of approach. I think some good was done and the public benefited from having that. I would like that model to grow. But getting back to your question, I am encouraged to believe it will continue, and I actually hope and pray it continues.
When we come back, how has China manipulated global supply chains to take advantage of the push toward electric vehicles? Welcome back to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance, here with Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation on China and national security. Yeah, the CCP, Steve, certainly one of the most cunning and ruthless regimes on the planet. And one of those areas of manipulation, as you mentioned, is the economic sphere. Yeah. When it comes to trade and the economic dynamic between the U.S. and China, how have import and export dynamics between the two countries evolved in recent times?
There's been, because of the pressure of tariffs, a change in the mood in the United States, but also some of our allies, about the sensitivity of supply chains, overdependence upon China. The COVID experience, pharmaceutical industry was exposed for having, I think, an unacceptably high level of dependence on China. And China proved during that period it was willing to withhold as a political weapon. And so they proved that they would not be a responsible stakeholder, but also they couldn't be a reliable partner. And I think that was an unwelcome but necessary wake-up call to a lot of our big investment houses in the United States and some of our big manufacturers. And so while they are not far enough down the road of strategic decoupling or friend-shoring and safe-shoring our supply chains, they began moving. And so talk of tariffs as being a legitimate and maybe necessary tool for imposing cost but forcing change in negotiation, the talk of outbound investment controls, the need to work among advanced allies to control standard setting and proliferation within tech, not just military technologies, but artificial intelligence, space, chips, and other areas. We have to make sure that the most advanced developments are among transparent and accountable, responsible stakeholders. And China has volunteered not to be one of those. And so we have a lot of adjustment to make. And I think that is the biggest change.
Now, how can we strike a balance, Steve, between economic independence and the efforts by both countries? Because you see China starting to want to decouple with the U.S. to a certain extent, ensuring self-sufficiency and reducing reliance on China's imports.
Well, it's a big challenge. It's an important one. I think it's one that America and a lot of our allies would rather not have to face. That's why they made the big bet for 50 years of showering China with investment and favorable loans, favorable access to our markets. Really, I don't think there has ever been as generous an offer and environment to any country in human civilization as was given to China when it was coming out of poverty. I would add self-inflicted poverty. It was the Communist Party that destroyed the economic and political system of China, and it was out of that low base that the world, led by the United States, was giving them a lifeline. So obviously, I think our leaders, government and commercial, would rather not have to face this need to diversify and decouple. But really, it's under Xi Jinping that strategic decoupling began. The use of the word strategic decoupling came out of China. And it's really just an echo in the United States that began to capture news attention in recent years. But basically, under Xi Jinping, China has been trying to sanction-proof its regime. And if it was overly dependent on the West for banking, investment, manufacturing, or other parts of their supply chain to supply us, then they would be subjected to crippling sanctions that could compel changes in political or foreign policy decisions. So they wanted to have that independence, and we're moving in that direction. Now our choice is, how are we going to manage this? And how fast or slow will that process be? And so we're going to have a much different approach to our own hemisphere. I think as the United States, we're going to have to rediscover the 49th state, Alaska, and realize that it's endowed with immense natural resources that could fill some of our needs on rare earths and energy and other critical minerals. And we're going to have to look at our hemisphere differently as a labor force that wouldn't require trans-Pacific two-way trips to process key things that allow our military supply chain to exist and the engine of economic growth to move forward. And I think our allies in Asia and other regions can see opportunity in this too, but we're just going to have to work together to friendshore things out of overdependence in one country. But because there's been a profound cost to this overconcentration of manufacturing and opportunity in China, and the rest of the world deserves to benefit from these positive developments and not have them taken away by an irresponsible government in Beijing.
Steve, you alluded to the policy of strategic engagement. Talk to us about that, unpack that a little bit more for us, and tell us why it's ultimately proven to be a bad idea.
America was an engine for a lot of trade in goods and services, and those impulses took us to China. Now, after the Communist Revolution, we had a period of isolation because of a policy of containment under the Cold War. That began to fray in the middle of the Cold War as the Vietnam War got worse. There was a notion that we could split the People's Republic of China from the Soviet bloc, and we could accentuate this Sino-Soviet split by leaning to one side. We decided, well, this missionary impulse of we've got something good and we can have a positive sum relationship, the communists got very good at echoing those words back to Americans and
Sounds
others.
familiar.
Yes.
The irony.
And this opportunity might coincide with the reform and opening policies of Deng Xiaoping in a way that allowed China to grow out of its problems. We doubled down on what we call the engagement policy after the Cold War. There were presidential business development missions to China. Our economic relations really exploded during the 1990s, and that's where the justification no longer held up that we were in a Cold War conflict and we needed to balance to one side. We found almost a new religion, and it was going to be internationalization of capitalism, trade, and Western values. The end of history had happened, and that's what led towards the integration into the World Trade Organization and that arc that pulled us all the way through. Fundamentally, it was just based on the idea that the Chinese people living under the Communist Party are just like us. They want to prosper, they want a better future for their children, and the more we do this with them, they'll be motivated by profit, they'll be motivated by progress, and this will lead to a peaceful world that has greater opportunity, less conflict.
One sector that we've seen, at least in recent years, a great competition starting to emerge is in the EV sector.
Yeah.
What impact would you say tariffs have had specifically on renewable energy and as well as the electric vehicle production?
I think a threshold issue for Americans and American policy generally is that we don't want people to be forced to move in one direction on how their car happens to be powered, but we want them to be able to choose. And if they choose to go the route of energy that was derived in other ways, put into a battery, good for them. The Chinese government has been very, very successful in selling a big contradiction to the world. On the one hand, there is no greater abuser of the environment than China. On the other hand, it has monopolized the supply chain for solar panels, wind turbines, and a lot of components for electric vehicles, and they subsidize the manufacture of electric vehicles. They have stolen some of the designs and plans from some of the leading EV developers, and now they are engaged in dumping, which is not necessarily a tariff issue, but it is what we call a trade distorting behavior and non-market behavior. The big German brands are almost entirely dependent on Chinese partners to manufacture their EVs that now they're trying to compel their people to transition to, and it's heavily subsidized by China so that others can't compete on price. And so it has an employment distortion, market distortion, all of that, and ultimately with this horrible punchline of the Chinese being the least socially or economically or environmentally responsible sources of this supply chain. So tariffs, I think, have come in as a tool that the incoming Trump administration has talked about to block these heavily subsidized EVs coming into the United States to distort our market. Tesla wouldn't be the only company that would be adversely impacted by that kind of move. And I think that one of the challenges of tariffs is going to be how they are multilateral or involve third-party countries. How do tariffs apply there as much as they would for a direct export from China into the United States? If you really believe in the environment, you're going to have to diversify the supply chain. You can't be dependent on China for this. And if you really believe in doing these things, they need to be voluntary. It's going to probably need to be done among the true responsible stakeholders in advanced technologies and chips and other leading private sector elements.
We'll be back in just a moment. And after the break, how will Trump's cabinet picks approach China? And how do lobbyists influence lawmakers in Washington? Welcome back to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance, here with Steve Yates, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation on China and national security. I want to get your thoughts, Steve, on some of President Trump's cabinet picks. You have Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, Elise Stefanik, Peter Navarro. I want to get your thoughts on what you make of these picks in terms of their approach to China.
Well, they're actually, I mean, when people think of a cabinet, they probably only think of a handful of people, but it turns out a president's cabinet is plentiful, and anyone can look online and see a couple dozen different appointees. I would emphasize, somewhat consistent to what I was trying to open the conversation with this comprehensive approach to the malign influences of the CCP, every one of the cabinet positions is relevant to this. You look at the Environmental Protection Agency, what we were just talking about is relevant to that. The Ag Department, a friend of mine, Brooke Rollins, has been nominated to be put forward to be Agriculture Secretary, whether it's the acquisition of land, or setting standards on our food supply. I mean, our food supply is national security. So every one of these positions, from energy to ag to interior to all over, are going to have importance in dealing with the challenge the CCP presents. Some of these personalities are familiar from Trump's first term. Peter Navarro was an outspoken and active advocate for a tougher approach to China, and it's one I broadly agree with. Don't give them freebies. Make them have to earn their place at the table. And in general, our private sector needs to stop favoring China more than it does America. And whether that goes from manufacturing but into a whole host of other sectors. So obviously President Trump having Peter Navarro back in a senior counselor job, it means that his way of thinking is alive and well in the administration. There is another friend who was in the first Trump administration. It hasn't yet been announced, but I think still plays an absolutely defining role in how the president thinks and what the second term will address, and that's Ambassador Bob Lighthizer. He literally wrote the book on trade, tariffs, supply chains, but also the challenge of China. And anyone who would like to go on Amazon or any other provider and look up Lighthizer and China, they'll find a book that goes into great detail. And he is a beloved, almost member of the First Family. His deputy is now the U.S. Trade Representative. His way of thinking is shared by a lot of people across these appointments. And I think that's to the good. I have deep admiration for how he thinks strategically and operationally. Marco Rubio obviously is very well known in speaking out on the challenges that the China and the CCP have presented to us. Very important leadership in an international parliamentary kind of collaboration. And I think that helped internationalize the conversation in important ways, played a good role in getting our allies in Europe and some other geographies to think again about these challenges. I think that helps prepare the way for the Trump 2.0 agenda to be better understood and hopefully be met with more cooperation than confusion or resistance, which might have been the case in Trump 1.0.
Steve, going back to Ambassador Lighthizer and his policies, which really shaped a lot of our trade policy, how difficult is it once you can have these ideas, but once you start to put them in place to sort of resist, you know better than anybody, the lobby here in Washington, D.C., and it's not just China. There's a lot of American interest and lobbying firms that come at in all different directions. How big of a challenge is that?
Well, it's huge, but I would also say it's something that we've allowed and we've built. It's part of that establishment engagement policy, and if you've kind of allowed those arguments and interests to run amok for 50 years, you can't be shocked that they will be weeping and gnashing of teeth when the boulder starts rolling back on them in terms of shifts of policy and the burden of responsibility. I think Ambassador Lighthizer in some ways embodies that. I mean, he has been very vocal and active working on these things from the Reagan administration forward. I mean, really for 3 full decades, beating the drum about these things among Republicans and Democrats. It wasn't a partisan issue for him. It was strategic. It was economic. And he makes the case that economic security is national security. It's in the book. It's in what he talks about. And he had to work for decades to try to align with a president that was going to have a policy agenda that would meet with that way of thinking. But also for both of them, the country has changed. And that is what I think broke the dam for their way of thinking about these things, because both Ambassador Lighthizer and Donald Trump can be found either in congressional hearings or on American television as far back as the 80s, speaking about the problem of trade distortions, assumptions about China and some of our other trade partners, the need to make sure that we preserve manufacturing, especially in critical areas in the United States, All these things are ideas that they have talked about for a very, very long time. So it took a movement in America for them to be able to be on top of, to be able to begin pushing back. But even with that movement coming into power in 2017 at inauguration going forward, definitely met with a lot of resistance in government, private sector, media, and internationally. I think the COVID pandemic was a turning point, but I think that other things helped accelerate this shift too. The Phase 1 trade agreement was negotiated, but it wasn't honored and implemented by China. And so you had a president in his first term try that, and he has the experience of these are the results so far. How does that inform what a re-engagement would look like? I think a re-engagement will still happen, but it will be, I think, leavened with the experience of having tried something and it didn't pan out. I think that China's aggression towards its neighbors has increased in recent years in ways that no one can say was provoked by the United States. And so the nature of that has changed. And I think some of the wolf warrior diplomacy and the aggression in the United States that has been more widely reported, whether it is CCP agents attacking dissidents in the United States, the technology and surveillance systems, the debate about ownership of data and privacy that Americans treasure but didn't realize they'd compromised so much, not least of which to a hostile entity like the CCP. I think there's been a bit of an awakening. So all those things had to happen, and for people to kind of recognize them and accept them before powerful figures like Donald Trump and a friend like Ambassador Lighthizer could have a lane to run in. But I think we're there. There'll still be challenges in Congress, in industry, but even when you look at some of the big investment houses, they've been mugged by reality in China.
Steve Yates, we really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that is all we have for you this evening on the Capitol Report. For round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com/live and download our NTD mobile app. From the nation's capital, I'm Steve Lance. Have a nice evening. See you back here tomorrow.